Hi everyone, welcome to the Mobile UX Marathon. It is wonderful to have you here today. We're going to give everyone just 1 or 2 minutes to get logged on. So while we're waiting, if you want to just pop into the chat and say hello, let us know where you're joining us from. We are all based out of San Francisco today for the first time in 6 weeks. We're all in the same location. So yeah, let us know where you're joining us from and we'll get started at 11:02. Got Dallas, Texas. It is hot in San Francisco. It is in the 90s today, so I'm sure some of you across the country are experiencing the same heat wave. It's unusual here. Hey, Kevin. Got LA, North Carolina. Colombia. All right, we will go ahead and get started. Feel free to keep typing in where you're joining us from, but for now, we have a lot of content to get through, so I'll go ahead and jump in. My name is Emily Ferdinandi, and I am joined today by 2 of my wonderful colleagues who are going to talk about how to improve UX using progressive web technology. So I'm joined by Cheney and Philip, 2 of our engineers at Google who focus specifically on mobile and work with clients across a lot of different industries on things like PWA and AMP, which we'll talk about today. Quick agenda, we are going to just cover our final sign off on the mobile marathon, do a quick recap on the video from Ryan, and then I'll turn it over to Cheney and Philip to talk about AMP and PWA as well as some case studies. As with all of the marathon sessions, we'll leave 20 to 30 minutes at the end for Q&A, both a combination of questions that you submitted on the marathon website and then some live questions that you put into the chat. So as we're going through today, feel free to type in any questions. We'll keep track of them as we go and then try to get through as many as possible at the end of the session. So this is our last session. You can see what we've covered so far. All of the pre-recorded or all of the recorded videos from the previous webinars are on the YouTube channel. But here we are, our last session, so thank you for sticking with us through the entire marathon. Quick recap from Ryan Warrender, what he covered on the videos on the website. Basically, he was just showing us how you can use these mobile technologies to really improve and innovate on your mobile experience. So you can make sure you have really fast pages with AMP. You can provide a native experience with PWA with features like add to home screen. And notifications. With Google Pay, you can simplify your checkout experience and you can simplify sign-in with Google Sign-In. So he gave an overview of all these. We're going to go a bit more in detail today with Philip and Cheney. And they really are experts in this field. So this is a really wonderful opportunity to use that Q&A session at the end to answer any questions that you may have. So with that, I will turn it over to Philip to talk about PWAs.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. Hi, everybody. I'm Philip. I'm a specialist engineer at Google. And so today we're basically going to be covering how PWAs can improve your user experience. We're going to talk about a few of the features that make PWA so conducive to a great user experience, and also discuss how we should be utilizing them. So the 3 main takeaways, I'll list them out, are essentially that 1, you can start creating your PWA experience today. It is really easy to get started creating PWAs and working with PWA features. 2, the best PWAs aren't defined by the modern web features that you can utilize, but rather by their feel and how easy they are to use. And finally, we'll talk about when PWAs make sense and when they do not. So in the past, right, we've asked users why apps and why websites. And in general, it comes down to kind of two things. Apps are generally for more invested users, users who are going to be utilizing a service a lot, and websites are more exploratory. Generally, apps historically have had better, more responsive UIs. You can customize that experience to a great degree. And in addition, they're pretty fast, right? And that's because you've downloaded everything to your phone beforehand. So even though the initial usage can take a few minutes, or maybe you have to go connect to a Wi-Fi connection to be able to download the package, once it's on your phone, everything's there and it's really fast. Websites, on the other hand, right, they don't require that installation. A user could type in a URL, they can tap on a link, they can snap a QR code. That makes it really good for exploration, marketing, and just quickly getting from place to place. But what if you didn't have to stop there, right? What if you could have both? What if you could have an experience where not only are you able to quickly go from website to website, but you also had that great UX, you had that customized experience, and you had that speed to action. So one of the ways that we can enable those reliable experiences are with service workers, which is one of the technologies that enables PWA. The current way of doing things, of course, is that if you need to get a resource, you communicate with a web server. And as soon as you lose connection, right, you get the dinosaur, right? You're offline. Your phone's not going to be able to access that resource, even if you have things cached on your phone. However, with service workers, which are essentially a small JavaScript snippet that acts as a proxy server between your device and the web server, you're able to decide what to do with every request that comes from your user. So even if you are offline, the service worker is going to be able to say, hey, we're offline, go ahead and grab this from the cache and serve up some kind of an experience. That lets you create good offline experiences where somebody is notified that they're offline. It allows them to maybe perhaps be able to see something that they've saved to their profile. For example, like if you purchase tickets, you'll still be able to see your tickets because they're stored in your cache and you don't necessarily have to have a connection. There's a lot of use cases here, and we'll talk about a few of them today. One of those is the app shell. So most apps on your mobile phone work with that kind of a architecture where you have like a view and then content gets loaded in, right? So every time you open up an app, you get the same kind of skeleton, and then it gets filled in with whatever content you need. And with PWA, it's really easy to accomplish this on the mobile web. So this gives you, native-like interactions. It allows you to save user data, right? So they don't have to keep reloading the shell every single time. And it feels a lot faster because when you open that website, that shell is going to be there, and then you start filling it in with content. So here's an example of, kind of what we mean by an application shell, right? We separate the navigational aspects and the, stuff like the menu and the header apart from the content, right? So that when you load it, even offline, you'll still be able to see those navigational aspects. But then the content, when it can come in, it'll get loaded in. And something that's important to note is that service workers can be utilized in a lot of different ways. So one of these examples is with eBay, where they couldn't refactor their entire site, right? And that's totally understandable. Not everybody can just redo their entire website to fit with this particular use case that we discussed before, which is the app shell. So what eBay did is within their existing architecture, right? And that's something I really want to stress. Within their existing mobile website architecture, they utilized service workers to prefetch listing pages. So basically, when a user executed a search, the top 5 results on that page had their HTML pages and the whatever required files loaded in the background, so that if somebody were to click on one of those links, it would pop up almost instantly, because essentially we're predicting that when somebody searches for something, they're most likely going to click on one of those top 5 links. So this is a way in which service workers were utilized in a way that didn't require them to completely re-architecture their website, but still fundamentally improved the user experience. And I think that really highlights how PWAs are super easy to get started with, and how essentially on any sort of a stack, any sort of architecture, you're able to install your service worker and get up and running. The other piece of PWA, of the PWA puzzle, are manifest files, which are simply just a repository of information about your app. So you can basically create a PWA and start passing the Google Lighthouse PWA metric within a week. It is really simple to set up, and most service workers are actually under 100 lines, so they're not too difficult to create either.
Cool. So thanks, Philip, for kind of quickly explaining what a progressive web app is and how that might be able to, improve your UX. Oftentimes people think about, well, progressive web apps is one entity, it's one thing I ship. It's like, now I have a website, I have a mobile website, then I have a native app or a PWA. And the one thing we really want to stress is that PWA really is more like a gradient. You kind of pick and choose as you migrate your web from a generic kind of static content or poster or whatever it might be into something interactive. But as you upload that interactivity and make that seem, to Philip's point, a bit more app-like, and add in re-engagement opportunities like push notifications, access from home screen, suddenly it kind of blurs the lines. And you kind of pick and choose what makes the most sense for your users, what do they derive value from, and if they derive value from maybe coming from a home screen or being re-engaged to your brand from push notification, how does that change the UX and design, the conversion funnel of your site? Your conversion funnel in a pre-PWA world may very well be different than what it is after you make the migration over to PWA. So to that point, there are a lot of choices you're going to need to make, design choices specifically, to make your experience a great PWA. So, just to go back to the definition of a PWA, oftentimes we get lost in the specific details like service workers or install or push notifications. These are just tools that the progressive web app umbrella allows you to use to up-level your user experience. But the key part of a really good PWA is that it needs to be an experience that the user believes is worth keeping. You assume this by default when it's native app, right? Because you've already self-filtered, for users who would go to the Play Store or the iOS App Store and say, hey, I want to download this application, save it to my phone because there's a reason I want to do that. We've gone through those exercises of we download something, we download something because, oh, I want to keep my flight information, or because I want to be logged in and pick up where I left off. These are the mindsets that you want to think about adding to your website when users can now re-engage and activate this from the home screen. But then what does it make something worth keeping or returning to? Like many native apps, you can easily make bad progressive web apps. While on the web, you don't have like the Play Store or the App Store saying, here are common guidelines, or you don't get to be in the store or something like that. The great thing about the web is that you put something out there, the browser does its best job to render content on the screen. But that also means that you kind of are driving your own car. You decide whether it's a good experience or a bad experience. Just because it's a PWA doesn't necessarily mean it's a great experience or the right experience for a user. Mileage, of course, varies, and it's kind of oftentimes in the details that really matter. Because you can create anything you potentially want on the web. We see a lot of sites that maybe add a service worker, add an app manifest file, but they change nothing. And then they ask, well, why aren't my conversion metrics or engagement metrics improving? And it's because just mashing these things together doesn't mean that they're thinking about this in the right way. So what I mean by like a mindset shift, we don't see many sites right now who are PWA who kind of necessarily think about how users experience this brand differently. On the bottom, you see a couple of examples of like what an install button on the web outside of an app store might look like, enabled by PWAs. But the question is, when the user sees a call to action like this, like install or save to home screen, why would they do this? And one of the common examples for and maybe in an airline. What they could potentially do is say, well, my whole site might not be a full PWA, but there might be an app portion of my experience with, let's say, I'm going to make up an airline here, right? We'll call it like mobile airlines, right? And when I buy a ticket on mobile airlines, I'm maybe subscribing for a trip next week for 3 days, and maybe there's a perfect app experience that will serve me for that 3 days throughout the duration of the flight. So maybe after I bought my ticket, it says, hey, do you want to install this kind of instant application of some sort powered by the web that will live on your device on your home screen, so that as you're flying, you go into the airport, you click on that through the home screen, and your details are already saved right there. That's just one example of like answering the question of what really makes this an application and not really just a document that you're viewing through a window called the browser. One easy way to really think about this is a comic from XKC that I really like, is like, I won't read the thing here, but think about what if the best native app experiences, many of us have iPhones or Android phones. Why do you go back to the app to use every day? What do you like about that? Now, what if you can have that exact same experience without ever having to think about installing? What if you can be linked there from Google, from Twitter, from Instagram, or any of the other services, deep link directly into this experience? That experience you're imagining might not be like the website you have right now. Think about what makes this different. But of course, it's not even necessarily about the install, right? Because if you think about it, the install part of it is actually the less desirable portion of what you're imagining about what makes the app a good experience. The install is what you kind of put up with to get that nice experience. The promise of the PWA is, well, let's forget the install. Let's forget the worst part about installing kind of applications and get that great experience immediately when you click on that link or when you want to go back to your site. Sometimes people ask, well, apps and web, compare me to other sites on the web that are in the same vertical or do the same thing. Unfortunately, to be the bearer of bad news, and when the user engages with your PWA, and this is specifically for mobile PWAs, you can build PWAs for desktop too, but we'll talk about mobile specifically for now. When people use your PWA or your website, they're using a phone with some set screen in the same place as they use a native app. And so unfortunately, whatever UI you ship on your website is being compared to the best UIs that they probably experience on native applications. And that's what you really got to think about, what your brand is actually kind of being compared to. So it really is just about giving users the best experience where they're at. PWAs, again, are web experiences that are worth keeping. Another way I really like to think about this is, when you download a good application, what makes it an application instead of a document? We've been through web experiences where every link we click through, we go from document to document. It kind of feels like if, every time you click on the link or every time you click on something, you have to like get your keys out, open this door, and it's just like cumbersome to move from room to room. And what happens as a user is you move through rooms less because there's a cost to navigating between page to page. One of the cool parts of what Philip was talking about with the app show and kind of abstracting away, really what is the destination and kind of opening up the navigation patterns of a good native app pattern is that you go through maybe one locked door, and then normally that's the kind of app install or something like that. But once you get into your site, what does it mean for your users to be able to move from one page to another seamlessly without kind of losing the context, without feeling like they're being blocked by a door? And that's really what you want to think about when you're kind of creating these experiences. This is meant to be a lightning talk. Obviously, with a good PWA talking about kind of site design and UX, we can talk for days about this. If you want more content about this, let us know. We can obviously think about a new series in the future. So please send your feedback. As a quick call out to the team here. But we'll quickly call out some common examples about mindset differences about a good PWA. So one common one is about screen transitions shouldn't feel slow. Many of you might have used the Lighthouse tool to determine if a website is a progressive web app or not. And, the Lighthouse uses something called the progressive web app checklist to see if something is a PWA. Parts of this can't actually be detected automatically. One of those rules is called navigation should not feel dependent on network, because the network inevitably for mobile is slow, right? As you go onto the tube or the subway or something like that, lose network connection, and you don't really want your site experience to be dependent on those things. One of the reasons that makes native apps great is that we kind of understand as users if the internet is slow. We don't necessarily blame the site or the app because the UI is there. We click on something, we're able to switch tabs or move between things seamlessly. And yeah, sure, we're waiting on some dynamic data to come in, but the UI is educating us to say, hey, it's not our fault that something is being janky. Our UI is being assembled on the fly. And so these are kind of interesting things that set good sites apart from bad sites. Some other common examples are like tappable areas. If you want your site to be more than just a document, or for those who remember, a glorified image map, you really need to have touch feedback. And not just touch feedback that's present, fast touch feedback. We talk about page speed a lot, right? And page speed really is just one small part of speed. It's just how fast your initial state loads. But for an application, that's a conversation between you and your users. And in a conversation, there's multiple back and forth. The user is going to tap on something, they're going to click on the sidebar, they're going to select elements, they're going to swipe things. Are you responding to that user input with something within 100 milliseconds? Oftentimes, this is kind of done poorly on websites in that, oh yeah, we added a touch event handler or something like that, and you touch on the search box, and then nothing happens. And what do? The user touches again. Or some modal dialog pops up 5 seconds later, and they ended up in a state they weren't intending to be at to begin with. You need to make sure that you have fast feedback that makes sense for every little thing, because there are also issues where the feedback doesn't make sense, right? I think sometimes we see nav bars or menus where we're trying to scroll, but instead of showing feedback that something is scrolling, you're also showing feedback that you're selecting something. Right? In those situations, it just makes the UI feel a little bit broken. It breaks the illusion that there's some sort of like reliable, predictable user interface on the screen. There are also other situations where, you load the page and you get a design from your designer and it looks great. It looks very app-like. But when you start using it, again, the devil's in the details. Oh, you're about to click a button, and for whatever reason, your finger just lingers for half a second longer. And what browsers do is it still potentially thinks your progressive web app or your website is a document. And so it starts selecting text, right? In this case, the icon here is being selected by the default browser action, or even in cases where the flip side is true. The user is trying to select text, but you override that action and you can't select that text. Don't mess with predictable user behaviors. It's important that you allow you meet user expectations. If it looks like a button, it should act like a button. And the moment it doesn't act like a button, you can be perfect in all your other implementation details. You kind of lose that belief that, oh, this is an application. You're back to being a glorified image map or a document of some sort. And so this is what I was talking about, that every interaction really needs to have instant and kind of predictable feedback. Instant and predictable, it's very easy to say, but I think there's a lot, if you just take one thing away from having a good UX on the site, this pretty much sums it up. Instant means that you shouldn't be shipping a completely new application code for every single interaction on the page. There's no way you're going to meet that 100 millisecond budget for everything. Instant also means that you need to have touch feedback so that things actually feels like an interface as opposed to you shifting a document around. Predictable means a lot of things where you want your application to respond in a way where if the user was using like a native app or using kind of material design components or iOS design components, there are certain behaviors that they expect from a sidebar, from a navigation element. It's important to innovate, but innovate in areas that actually make sense instead of making up new patterns for every single interaction kind of on the page. Only reinvent the wheel where it makes sense. Users have cognitive load for every interaction that they might want to do kind of on the website. Sometimes we see sites where it's like, oh, we're going to put our like hamburger menu in the kind of right side of the screen, and then when you click on that, we're going to add another hamburger menu inside. That's not a pattern you really see in really good kind of native apps. And just because you can do it on the website doesn't mean that that's the right thing to do. Users are going to get confused. They're not going to be able to rely on interaction patterns that they've already kind of learned over time. And the more they have to kind of learn new things, the less likely they are to be engaging with the things you actually want them to engage with like book a room, sign up for this thing, or et cetera, and those kind of stuff. So, another big kind of item about PWA UX is what we call spatial awareness. I think as web designers, we're still stuck a lot in just thinking like desktop designers, right? And in desktop, we're gonna put everything on the screen. There's a lot of screen estate. Density is important. It's just gonna all be there, right? And maybe you just scroll up and down. And a lot of times when people say we're mobile first, what they do is, well, we're just gonna make everything one column, right? Our 3-column layout is now 1 column, and it's now mobile first, except it's not, because you're still shipping all your desktop code. Putting everything into a stack doesn't mean you're prioritizing your information kind of adequately. And then what usually happens after that is, because of internal politics or things like that, some teammates might say, well, now my element is below the fold, and it's important to be above the fold. And the next thing you know, you're cramming everything above the fold, and because you have less kind of screen estate, and you have to get this really janky layout where it doesn't really make sense because nothing is prioritized, right? If everything is prioritized, then nothing really is prioritized. But how do you solve that for mobile? And one of the cool things about what the material design spec kind of indicates is that you want to help using fast navigations, using good design patterns. You help your users understand the scope and the landscape of your application, of your website, without them necessarily having to see everything. All right, and you do this by making sure there are consistent design elements. There's use animations where it makes sense. That see on the example here on the left side, even though I don't see both of these grids at the same time, once I click on favorites, because of the slight changes in the UI, as a user, I still remember that, hey, this My Pets app or website isn't just what I see on the screen. There's something to the left kind of hidden away. How can you take advantage of these kind of design patterns to create more app-like feelings on your page? So we're running up against kind of the presentation time. We do want to make time for kind of Q&A and things like that. So we'll quickly try to wrap up some of these with 2 kind of good examples here. Spotify has been working on progressive web app. They actually have a more full-featured experience on desktop that you guys should check out. But on the right here, you kind of quickly see some of the things they do here. If I were to show this animation to someone who wasn't aware of what progressive web apps or even native apps are, they might just tell me, oh, well, that's a native app, right? I downloaded that from the App Store. This is what it is. And truth be told, this can be completely created as a web experience. It doesn't look like a typical website layout. It's not trying to say we're going to make everything into a single column. It's trying to design for the mobile screen, the form factor. As I interact with this, the buttons respond immediately to my touch input, right? There are slight animations that come up from the side and things like that helps me understand how to actually use these patterns. The back button, the close button, they're all positioned in areas where, as a user, because I've used other websites and other apps before, I know where to look. Again, they're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but it's with the design guidelines on here, it's very much Spotify. Right? You don't see this type of design patterns very often. They're innovating in areas that set them apart, and that's really, really interesting. The other piece here is like Starbucks. One really cool thing about Starbucks journey is that they didn't spend time jumping straight into adding the app manifest file or a service record, things like that. Because if the goal for a progressive web app, the goal for a website really is to say every touch input should be instant. And websites should and can be as capable as a lot of native apps can be. Well, the foundational layer of your website is probably the most important thing you can do. For having less code, not having unoptimized code, making even sure basic website optimizations like caching, image optimizations are kind of there before you start adding in these kind of new next-gen or modern capabilities. Other things that Starbucks kind of does really interesting is they have their own native app, definitely, that's shipped in the Play Store. They have a progressive web app that's available on the web, but they have a consistent design pattern, right? They use the same design language. They have components that are shareable between these 2 different kind of code stacks, so that the animations, the interactions are predictable if users pick up this UI. So it becomes implementation details. Right? What's important is actually the UX of the end experience. So that's a quick primer about some mindset shifts, some things you might want to consider when you're developing and designing your kind of progressive web app. But maybe we should talk about what should be a PWA and maybe what shouldn't be. Phil, do you have any ideas?
Sure. I mean, PWAs, as we saw in those examples, can be used in a lot of interesting ways. So, for example, for Spotify, it was for lead generation, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't really the actual app, but it was rather a way for somebody to enter. At the same time, right, we shouldn't think that PWAs should be applied to every use case, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes a landing page is just a landing page, right? It's meant to get people a promotion or something that you want them to click on or sign up for. And PWAs don't necessarily make sense in that scenario.
Yeah. And I think just to call back to the airline example, it doesn't mean that like the entire airline site, mobileairlines.com or whatever, I actually don't know where that goes. But I'd say that entire site might not be a PWA, but there might be small user experience in there that would be. What we don't want to do is to say, well, let's just make the entire site a PWA, and the user doesn't have a mental model, right, about what it is. Like, I came here to just sign up for something. Why are you trying to get me to install a sign-up sheet? That doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
But maybe all you have right now is a website that is a sign-up sheet. But perhaps what you're signing up for, that service could have a progressive web app of some sort. It doesn't necessarily have to be consumer-facing. There are some companies out there thinking about, inventory management in a physical store. Maybe your staff could actually use a progressive web app to keep track of inventory management, scan barcodes, and things like that. And that might actually be a good way of leveraging this. But maybe delivering daily coupons, just the daily kind of like sales of the day, that's more of an article, right? Or like a poster, which doesn't make sense as an application.
Yep, I think that's a great point. Being able to split up the functionality of a website into parts that are PWAs and parts that aren't is a really interesting idea, and I think it allows for a lot of options with how you utilize it.
Yeah, and we did say earlier that you can use how you would design and ship a native app as a starting point about what should be a PWA. Because if for those folks on the line that might have a native app and a website, you must have gone through some kind of design thinking or something along the lines of like, what does my app kind of actually do? It's probably a subset of what your website does. A similar kind of exercise might be useful here, but it's still slightly different because the web is, the amazing part of it is that things can just be there in a URL. You can actually pay the cost of having multiple apps more easily than having multiple apps in the App Store, which you have to independently market and promote, right? And so there's different kind of cost benefits there.
Exactly, and in addition, they'll be just way more accessible, right? I mean, who hasn't forgotten their App Store passcode, right? And then has to go do recovery and figure all that out when you could just go to a URL and get straight to business, right?
Yeah. So that's a general idea. I think the space is pretty nascent. We don't know what would be a great PWA. I think there's a lot of things that the different platforms out there, right? Not just Google, Microsoft, and other companies are all very invested in PWAs, and they're building things to the platforms that help users get to these app-like experiences faster and in a more kind of context-driven way. And we're kind of excited to see what you guys all kind of make and how user expectations change over time.
All right. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to switch it over to your video. All right, we can see you now for the Q&A. Hello.
That's us.
Hello.
Surprise.
Hi, everybody.
And we've had a lot of really great questions submitted via the live chat. So unlike our typical ones, I'm going to go back and forth, maybe a pre-submitted and then live, mix it up a little bit. All right, so we'll start with a pre-submitted question. With PWAs, how do you ensure the customers their data is safe as it is in the native app store? So it sounds like kind of privacy security with a PWA.
Yeah, I think a common misconception is that the web is more insecure than in native apps. I think there's pros and cons to both, right? The App Store is a place where some entity says you can or cannot be, and there's some protections there. But obviously, there are millions of apps in an app store, some things might not be able to get checked. And the thing about native apps is that they're not sandboxed. A lot of times they exist on your device and they ask for a lot of permissions and things like that. So the risks are definitely there. What's really cool about the web is that with the web sandbox, with every single tab kind of being constrained by design, you are actually exposing a lot of times by default less information about the user and from a security model than what natively installed applications might actually have. The risks are actually more because there isn't a governing body to say, oh, well, your UI is misleading. It's more about vulnerabilities that your own code and your implementations might introduce if you trick a user into accidentally submitting something. I think the issue isn't necessarily with the website itself container being insecure, but with potentially like a different site trying to pretend that they're your brand and getting users to sign in. But there are different ways to mitigate that. I mean, the whole change to HTTPS, the browser model being, showing that this is a secure, verified origin, definitely kind of helps with that. And having kind of secure elements of authentication, like third-party sign methods and like that, takes away some of the burden of security from you. Yeah, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, to that HTTPS point, I mean, browsers these days on mobile and on desktop, they'll yell at you if you're using an insecure website. Like if you're not on an HTTPS connection, it'll tell you like this site is insecure, right? So it's not only is that a bad look for your site, but it also warns users that they might be on a malicious site. So the web is significantly safer than it used to be, and I think especially to your point on mobile phones, right? The browser doesn't have access to necessarily all of the same APIs that an app might, and so you're going to be much more sandboxed.
And I think I'm pretty excited about this area. I mean, at Google I/O, we talked about what Chrome is doing to kind of make sure data privacy is first and foremost for users. I mean, our kind of peers at Firefox, Safari, etc., they're all been doing great work at kind of making sure visits are opt-in and data is only shared where necessary.
Great. All right, so our first live question, can you access the smartphone sensors from a PWA? So camera, location, etc. How does it work with those types of things?
Yeah, you want to start there?
Yeah, I mean, anything that you can use that the browser can access, a PWA is going to be able to access. In particular for notifications, on Android devices, you are able to get notifications from PWAs. You can actually use PWAs on desktop and get notifications there. I'm sure that all of you have gone to like a news website and it'll tell you, do you want to get news notifications from the Telegraph or whatever. That's using PWA. So essentially, you can access that on Android and desktop. iOS is slightly more limited. They still haven't given service workers the ability to interact with the notification system on iOS, but we are pretty confident that iOS will eventually come around, right?
Yeah, and we can only speak mostly to browser work on our side. Web capabilities is a huge area. What we consider most common capabilities, right, like barcode scanning, all these kind of things. This is actually very you can do that on the web. There might be more advanced things, right? Like the web AR spec isn't fully implemented. Web Bluetooth is something that exists, but isn't like widely adopted. But very interesting things that we're working on. Other things like contacts API, file system stuff. Those are all things on the roadmap that kind of we are working on. But truth be told, most experiences that we see right now on a lot of native apps, they're not using necessarily the most cutting edge pieces of device sensors. The common stuff like gyroscope, camera, that kind of stuff you can access.
All right, so the next pre-submitted question, how does the role of machine learning in helping users personalize their experience come into play as an example of progressive web app technology?
Sure. So when we're talking about like the front end and working on designing your front end, I would say that machine learning isn't necessarily present there. But if you do want to customize that user experience, there's certainly stuff that you can be doing on the back end to pre-process and get ready what you want to serve to that user based on what they've done in the past. I don't know if you want to.
I mean, there's a question here more kind of even outside of websites about like machine learning requires a lot of data. Where do you train the data, and what do you use the models for? And what should exist on device, and what can be done kind of on the server. I think there hasn't been great examples about for a typical website or typical app, what do you use machine learning for? the common patterns are like, we're going to predictably guess where you might go next, or from a content standpoint, search results, which ones are the user more likely going to engage with. But this is stuff that arguably doesn't have to exist on the client. It would exist in your server code, processing your data ahead of time, not on demand. I think we're excited about things like TensorFlow.js that allows for more creative usage of evaluating models on the fly and in a web context. It doesn't train the models on a phone. I think that would be computationally intensive, but it creates like new use cases, like being able to recognize something if the user is scanning something and it only happens on device. I don't know what the details are there. I think the question here, we're talking about personalization, and we're moving from a world, I think, that we're coming from like passive personalization where the user doesn't really know that they're getting a personalized experience, to more like active personalization where the user kind of like opts into personalization and recognizes the information that you're using to give them a personalized experience. There's a lot of dynamics and UX changes with regards to that. We don't know the full answers. It probably has something to do with authentication, remembering state, and a variety of those things. But yeah, that's an open question.
I think that's a really interesting idea, active versus passive personalization. I haven't really heard that before. That's a really interesting point. So the next live question, this is something that comes up a lot all the time, is SEO. So do PWAs cause any issues for SEO?
PWAs are websites. So, whatever SEO you're using for websites those techniques are relevant for PWAs without getting into details.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's the same. Like if you've made like a single page application before that doesn't utilize PWA features, adding PWA features isn't going to, suddenly change your SEO. I mean, it's the same, the same song and dance that's always been.
Right.
Yeah. Next.
This is another question that I personally get a lot and you touched on this a little bit, so maybe we already covered it, but do PWAs replace mobile apps? This says especially when designing for emerging markets, but I think this is a common struggle of, does this supplement my app? Does it replace my app? How do they work together? Anything else you wanted to add there?
Yeah, why not both? I mean, we saw that example of Spotify where it did not replace the actual mobile app, right? It was used as a way to lead somebody in. And you can see how that is useful in an emerging market where data is expensive, right? So somebody might not be willing to go ahead and download a full application. And so Spotify utilized that PWA to give them a little taster of like, what is Spotify like? What does it sound like? And then once you're convinced, you go ahead and make that investment into actually downloading the app, which I think sometimes we forget, right? In the US, like we just get all this data and we can just download something really quickly. But in other places, that might not be the case. A megabyte of data might cost significantly more to download.
Yeah, and what we want to get to is that the technology you choose to use are just implementation details. If a user has to think about whether this is built with JavaScript or with like Swift or something like that, you're probably doing something wrong, right? Ideally, the user can just go straight to getting the best experience possible. And native apps, it's easy for them to, in the system that closed system that they operate in, to kind of like push the boundaries of consumer UX. And now that we know what consumers really like to use, what kind of experiences, we should just be bringing those things over to other areas of entry, right? And make that the new baseline. And native apps are going to have new capabilities and all those kind of things. And we leave it up to companies and developers to figure out what makes sense. Have a bit of everything, have just a website, have just native app. I think it depends on your business model, really.
Yeah, I mean, a PWA, just like an app, it's a medium for delivering an experience. And depending on the conditions that a user is in, one medium might work better than the other. But it's not necessarily a, one or the other kind of scenario.
Yeah.
I think you had a slide. It's meeting users wherever they're at.
Yeah, exactly where they're at. Exactly.
All right, so I think we're on the live question again. So this is something that I personally know you both love to talk about, which is speed. So can we expect a PWA to perform with similar speeds compared to a native app? This says especially if the app is centered around presenting simple data to customers. So how does speed on a PWA compare to a native app? And maybe throw in a normal website as well.
It can. Going to my previous point, you can have extremely slow PWA. You can also have a very fast PWA. We've seen PWAs where one's launched in full screen, side by side, next to native app. and it feels just as fast. You'll find that websites we've been optimizing for fast initial load, right? Lighthouse, if you run it, it measures your speed of fast initial load. Most websites actually boot up faster than most applications, right? Launch a native app, launch a website. The website's probably faster. But when we talk about speed compared to the native app, oftentimes we're talking about my other point that I was making, that what we want to get to is that every interaction is super fast. On that point, we don't have great tooling, I think, of evaluating that. And because we don't have tooling there, actually, it's really hard for someone to say, well, is my website or PWA actually slow, right? Like, is my touch interaction laggy or not laggy? I think there's some things we can do to make that easier to measure. But there's, objectively, there's nothing getting in your way of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, right, if you have a PWA that has the app shell cached, ultimately, when you open up an app and you open up that PWA, you're getting the information to build that app shell, straight from your phone. You don't have to download anything. And then in terms of populating the content, the app and the website are doing the exact same thing. They're making an external request to get content, and then they're bringing it and rendering it. So that part, generally, you'll see like the same performance. But to Cheney's point, right, there's that idea of like, mobile websites feeling janky, right? Like it feels bad. Like I click something and it doesn't respond to me. I click on it again, and then it like takes two of my inputs and things start jumping around and it feels weird. That's kind of where we talk about, to that previous point we made in the presentation, which is that PWAs aren't defined by the features, right? Yes, you can do notifications. Yes, you can do offline. But if it doesn't feel like an app, that's not going to win people over, right? People aren't going to be impressed. It needs to be responsive. It needs to be fast. When you click something, you get the feedback within 100 milliseconds. You don't feel frustrated using the interface, which is something that mobile apps have always done really well, right? Because they're optimized to run, for example, for iPhone, they're optimized to run on that hardware. And it works really well. So that's kind of what we're talking about there.
Yeah, I mean, to get into some details here, like I think the native app ecosystem, it comes with a really set of like standard libraries, right? Like they give you the drop down or the sidebar. It's kind of like in your development toolbox. If I was a new app developer, it's kind of like fast by default because I'm not re-implementing some of these things. Yep. So those transitions, those interactions are already there. On the web, because we have such a long history, people can put something online, you go to some tutorial or you add this widget. It might have made sense a couple of years ago, but now it might not actually be the most efficient or something like that. So I think there's just different ways of shooting yourself in the foot sometimes. And without kind of good tools, without actively thinking about the problem, it's easy to fall into that trap and just think it's because of the web when really it's just the detail.
Yep.
I love this next question. I'm going to do another live question. What are the challenges that have to be considered when choosing a PWA? So what are some things that might not make it a good fit or are just, realities to consider?
Sure. PWAs, some of the features, right, that we've discussed, like, for example, like notifications or add to home screen, it's not yet clear in terms of how much users like to interact with that stuff, right? Like do you know any stats on how many users add to home screen?
We haven't shared anything publicly. So.
Okay, all right, well, never mind. Well, basically there's some, do users actually interact with those features? Notifications, for example, from websites, you visit a lot of websites. If you gave them all notification permissions, and if those websites aren't using those notifications in good faith, right? Like they're just spamming you coupon codes or updates just to get re-engagement, how can that, basically tarnish other PWAs and like just your own brand, right? So making sure that you're not abusing the extra capabilities that are given to you by a PWA, I think that's something that is important to keep in mind.
Yeah,
so it's a little bit of like the wild, wild west. Is that
it is a little
we don't
right.
know what we don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of
yet.
like a chicken and egg, right? Where you can build a great progressive web app, but then if the ecosystem assumes that 90% of traffic out there, is still normal websites, well, it's going to be the browser's going to be optimized. Google search, all these different platforms will be optimized to surface old school kind of content, not applications. But then you need a repository of those great applications before we start thinking about, what does the browser do? What does platforms do when you click on a link to a kind of PWA? And what's really interesting, to give a nod to like the kind of Android instant apps teams, is that they play with the idea of instant apps, just like web is trying to be less like documents and more like applications. Native apps are also thinking about, how can we make the friction of installs cheaper. And they're thinking about like, well, what if we start an instant app and communicate to the user? Okay, well, this is going to launch into full screen. This is an app experience, and we're going to do X, Y, or Z. There's a lot of like design ideas that needs to be figured out about what makes the most sense. And it goes into your design for your PWA too, because for your PWA, if you think about it, your user entry points are going to be more like your it's like deep link by default, right? Within the native apps, you kind of have to work towards a deep link. Most of your users come through the front door, right? You go to the front door of authentication and sign in after you download the app. Before your PWA, maybe the first impression is just like a website, right? You still have the browser bar or your deep link directly into your content. So how do you go from there and trace back to your front door and back to like a different room in your house? That entire pattern is kind of like different. And how does the user mindset change because of that? I think it's more, it opens up more possibilities instead of having to always go to the front door.
Yeah.
I'd say the other consideration is usually just time investment in building a progressive web app is the other consideration that you probably would always have to take into account. All right, so back to the pre-submitted questions. This is a little bit of a myth busting, I guess. So how would you respond to someone saying either, well, my native app converts better, or my site is already fast? Like, how do you think about some of these, this pushback?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at what the analysis is actually analyzing, it's very easy to say, oh, well, it's simply because it's an app. But what does that actually mean, right? Because apps, there's a lot of things to tangle up there. It's like, well, people who go install your apps, you're already self-selecting for a certain population. If I were to go through, you don't count that population into your denominator, right? When you look at app conversion rate, your denominator is people who have installed my app. You're starting from square 3. We're looking at your web conversion rate. You're like people who have come across this URL. Completely different kinds of intent, completely different kinds of populations. So you don't want to misattribute the conversion rate to to correlative causes, right? Correlation does not imply causation. And from our test, we see a lot of kind of interesting details there, where we see some sites where maybe all their native app experience are signed in, but their web experience isn't signed in. So let's say, let's look at conversion rates of people who are signed in, and suddenly the conversion rates are a lot more similar, which kind of is evidence to show that maybe it's not app, the entity itself being app, or entity itself being web, because in the ideal world, the user doesn't need to think about whether it's native code or web code or something like that. But users who would go search for your brand, install it, definitely is probably your power users, your top 5% of users, who, if you somehow extract that population on the web, probably are converting just as high as your native application.
Yeah, I mean, PWAs give you a unique experience or a unique opportunity to give a great experience to users who aren't sold on your product, right? Or aren't sold on your site, right? Like they go to your website, they're going to get a good experience. Whereas normally, right, that really good experience generally is kind of reserved to those mobile apps. And if you're going to go through the trouble of signing in, maybe paying, right? Some apps you have to pay for, right? Then you already have a user who's going to, expect a good experience, right? They came there for a specific reason.
Yeah, but there's no reason why you shouldn't chase that, right? I think there's some, that aside, there are definitely things that a average native app experience probably does better than your web experience. If you're an e-commerce site, right? E-commerce site is going to rely on user interaction. User probably has to tap, swipe, input, type something before there's some value they bring to your site. And so maybe take those interactions, 50 interactions or something like that. Are those as responsive on your website as the app? And solve that equation before making necessarily that comparison. I'm making it way more simple than it really is, because leadership really wants a well-summarized story, but hopefully it's something that you can kind of work towards.
All right, are there any issues with PWAs in like web accessibility compliance? Any of like the WCAG guidelines or anything like that that you know of? Anything that needs to be considered there?
Everything applies, that would normally in an app or a PWA, right? We're kind of at a point now where we can expect similar experiences in an app and on a mobile website. So I don't think there's anything specific that would be different.
Yeah. Just follow web best practices. I think there are interesting edge cases, maybe like, you can, there's something called WebAssembly, which lets you run like native C++ code on the web. And so you could imagine you have like I think we talk about AutoCAD, right? AutoCAD lets you do 3D models. They could take that entire, desktop application and put it on the web using WebAssembly. But then maybe some of the, accessibility things needs to be like manually configured as opposed to using the browser kind of DOM APIs, etc. by default.
Right. And actually, now that you mention it, right, when you create an iPhone app, right, it works on an iPhone. You create an Android app, it works on Android. When you create a PWA, that site could be accessed from a variety of different browsers and platforms. So I think testing is really important to basically make sure that if you have all these accessibility guidelines figured out on iPhone, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to feel the same way on Android. And just to double check that this universal app, right, which is a great power, is that you can create one application and it runs on all these different devices, is also giving the correct experience for all users on all those devices.
I think that is a perfect segue for our final question, which is, how would you recommend testing into a progressive web app? Is this something that you just create and launch and cross your fingers, or is there a different or another approach to moving to a progressive web app that you would recommend?
Yeah, lots of things to break down here. You want to start?
You have 4 minutes.
Sure. I mean, I think like any website redesign, if you are doing a full redesign, I think it's completely appropriate to do user testing or rolling it out like you would normally. I don't think PWA is, you shouldn't, first off, don't take our word for it when we just say like, PWA is the best choice for your business or whatever. Like, you should test things out. Doesn't necessarily apply to all business cases. So yeah, I think having a rollout or having some sort of user testing like you would for a normal redesign, I think is completely normal and appropriate.
You want to make sure that what your tests actually make sense. We see a lot of failed tests where they might launch, they'll tell me, we launched a PWA for this page and we're going to swap it in for this page in the user journey. And I'm like, that's not a PWA. Because if you're going back to what we're defining about PWA, it's a mindset shift. It's about the app-like experience. It maps to what the user, when I come in and have a task to complete, the entry point of that and the exit point. Right? That's one cohesive experience with one user interface. If you swap in a completely different user interface in the middle of that conversion funnel, because for some reason,
no matter how good that experience is, it's still going to feel jarring and weird when you all of a sudden come across a different feeling page, right?
Exactly. And so if you add a service worker on one page, well, the service worker is meant to keep that shell on throughout the experience. But if you're only there to control that one tiny slice, if anything, I might be even more confused as a user. I think predictability is very important. Even like something as basic as like speed. Like we've seen people who say, "Oh, we made this one page faster," while like our other page is slow. They're like, "Yes." I'm like, "Well, so if I come in, I'm still experiencing a 90% slow site. And if anything, you gave me a hint of how fast it could be. So now I'm potentially more dissatisfied than I was before." Right. And the data is very hard to sift through because it might be intuitive to think that users bounce when they see, the moment they see a slow site. But there's a lot of like, we have a task, there's something we want to do. On the page, there's actually a buffer time of some sort where there's a cognitive threshold, right? So maybe I experience something slow right now. I don't immediately bounce, but it makes the likelihood of me bouncing later on maybe even a fast loading page higher, right? And or even makes me kind of feel like there's more of a cost to interacting with the page. So maybe you're measuring engagement, right? You're like, we want more clicks into search results. Well, there was a slow page at some point in the top of the funnel or something like that. Well, you told me that your site is I submit, it's like sending an email versus like a chat, right? When you send an email, there's kind of like an expected delay. So I'm not sending emails at the same frequency as like me chatting, because I send an email, it goes out, I expect to wait before I get a response. And even if the response is super fast, like the whole mindset's already different. Whereas in chat, you're like, you type something, you kind of expect a response. If your friend ignores you, you're actually offended in some shape, way, or form. How can you create a UI that's more like the latter? Because if you suddenly swap in a chat in the middle of an email conversation, it's kind of weird, right? Right, the mindset's not quite right.
You don't say hi, you don't say sincerely. Yeah, it's a different feeling, right?
So unfortunately, the takeaway isn't necessarily that oh, that means you can't test a PWA unless you like change your entire site. But think about your user journeys, right? That's the user journey itself is what you want to optimize. If you can find one portion of your site that can be extracted out into like a end-to-end test, that might be the most useful part, or extract out specific things you want to improve on, like what Philip was talking about earlier with the eBay example. If it's just prefetching the next step, well, that's something that's like not changing the experience too much. It's not jarring, but it's just a little magic in prefetching the right search results before the user actually goes there.
Yeah, and I think just the last point that I want to make is that it's called progressive web apps for a reason. It is progressive, right? So you can use your existing experience and roll out PWA features to it like a service worker without necessarily changing the whole experience. I mean, you can go ahead and look in DevTools. You probably have a lot of service workers that are installed from a variety of sites that you've visited that you don't even know about because, you know, it just happens in the background. You don't have to, you know, accept the permission. So you can start changing things and see how users react to it, right? Like if they do notice that it's faster, if they do notice that it's a better experience, without necessarily going through a full redesign. So you can, you know, slowly build it up and, you know, test the waters.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. That was wonderful. And thank you to everyone who joined us today and is watching the recording as well. We appreciate you sticking with us for 6 weeks. We hope that you have learned a lot about the mobile web experiences. And we hope that we've answered all your questions. And if you have any other feedback, as Cheney said, please make sure to let us know. We'd be happy to host more of these in the future. But for now, that is it. So thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.